Is the Voynich Manuscript a modern forgery, and why it matters? This is a video version of a slide presentation I gave on the 19th of October for the NSA CSS Symposium on Cryptologic History. What is the Voynich Manuscript? Well, very briefly, it's a 200-plus page book written on calfskin, prepared in the early 15th century, and it's written in an unknown cipher code or language. There's a lot of theories as to what that could be, but no one knows what it says or what system it's written in. And it has enigmatic illustrations. We can see that there are plants and flowers, and there's naked women and zodiacs, but really they're mysterious. The actual purpose, whether they're real or not, is all up for debate. There's a lot of bizarre content in it. Just about everything's bizarre in it. The leaves on the plants can be weird leaves that don't exist in nature. Some can be real, but then they don't match the flowers, and the flowers can be weird. The roots rarely match the plant or any part of the plant. It's all open to speculation. As I said, there's a lot of naked women in there, and they're dancing, they're dancing in barrels, or they're swimming in baths and sliding down tubes. And you have various other things, symbols, wheels. They could be cipher wheels. They could be for astrological reasons, uses, or whatever, like as in the zodiac, but no one really knows. So what do we know for certain about the Voynich Manuscript? Absolutely certain, without a doubt. First of all, that Wilfrid Voynich, the book dealer, who he passed away in 1930, he owned it by 1912. I mean, we know this because he was showing it around by then, and it became quite a sensation. It was published, images of it were published, and generated a great deal of interest. So it appeared in 1912. The ink was made between 1904 and 1912. And the reason I have such a wide range there is because when the ink was tested in 2009, all they could do, they couldn't date the ink, they could only determine the chemical composition of the ink. And that fits inks made as far back as when the calf skin was dated. But it could have been made in 1912. We could make it today. We could get the ingredients and go make ink just like it today. So that's basically a wide range there. And as I said, the calves that made the skin died in the early 15th century. We know this because of radiocarbon testing, also done in 2009 or 2010 by the University of Arizona. Although that's all we know about it, of course, there's many different theories about what the book actually is and its purpose. The major paradigm is approximately that it is genuine, that it is 15th century because of the dating of the skin, and that it was sold to Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, by John Dee, the famous astrologer and physician he was a physician to Queen Elizabeth I, in fact. And then it was described in certain letters to the great polymath Kircher, great Jesuit. He had a great interest in ciphers, and that various people described this in letters to him during the 17th century. Then it disappeared, and Wilfrid Voynich says he bought it in the Villa Mondragone. He bought it from the Jesuits. And here you see a picture of the Villa Mondragone with a group of Voynich enthusiasts gathered for the 2012 centennial of Voynich's discovery. However, over time and over the years, various people have suggested maybe it's a forgery, and for various reasons, never really treated it as seriously or in depth, but I had various concerns as I went through various theories of my own, and I wanted to look more into the possibility. So I learned everything I could about the history of forgery, but most importantly, what do forgeries look like? What are the aspects, the characteristics of a forgery that make it jump out at you, that make you suspect it? And I call them forgery red flags, and here's my list. If they contain anachronistic content, if the content is of the wrong age for the purported age of the item, it could be artwork, manuscript, sculpture, then, for instance, if you see a 1957 Chevy in a book of Kells, you might want to suspect it. It doesn't belong there. It's anachronistic. If the experts all disagree, and there's quite a few forgeries have been determined or suspected of being a forgery in the first place because none of the experts could agree, because the forger very often puts in the wrong items from different times, different styles maybe, and different disciplines and so on. And then so when the experts look at it, they all have different ideas of when it's from, who it's by, and so on. The provenance is bad. The provenance is bad. Well, it's a forgery. It has no provenance except forgery. So the existing provenance is very often just very bad, and it should make you suspect an item if it has poor provenance. If the owner seller lies about provenance, obviously they're going to lie about it because they don't want you to know where it really came from. It's a forgery. Contains incorrect use of iconography. If a plow is a weapon, for instance, something's misused, forgers don't always get it right. So if you see something wrong, you might want to suspect it. Also, forgers don't have the right tools very often of the time and use the right methods or the materials. Hard to get the right material for another time and place and to use the right tools properly to make it. So you can suspect something is a forgery if you know this, if you see this. If it looks too new. Now, forgers, of course, they'll like bury pottery, they'll stain books, they'll even put wormholes in it, they'll beat them up, and so on. But if it looks too new, they don't always get everything, and it can be a good sign of forgery, a real red flag if it looks too new to you. There's a reluctance to produce the original because they don't want it tested, because if it's tested, it may be found out, and so they avoid having it tested. A real item, a true item, of course, nobody worries about. Why would you care? You know it's real, so if you know it's real, you don't care who tests it. Copy of illustrations from books and catalogs. If you live in a different time than the age of your purported forgery, of your purported original as a forgery, you have to borrow from books and catalogs and items from museums and so on to know what to put in there. And so a good example of this was the Archimedes Codex. It's a genuine codex, but it has forged Byzantine miniatures in it. And they were suspected because they were identical to ones, or very close to ones in catalogs. Almost a photographic image could have been traced or whatever from these catalogs, and somebody said, hey, that's not right, maybe it's a forgery, and they are forgeries. If you have to bribe anybody to give a positive opinion, that's very suspicious, and it's a red flag of forgery. So it might be a financial, it might be a reputational thing. Hey, I'll let you write a chapter in my book about the item, but you can't say it's a forgery. And if that's, if incentive is offered, that's suspicious because you shouldn't have to do that. If the original disappeared, if your golden tablets disappeared, and they can't be examined, similar to being reluctant to produce it, but if it's gone completely, you might be a little suspicious of that. Now, I put that in black, the reason being that we know where the Voynich is. These others, arguably, everything's arguable in the Voynich, arguably, I believe that those 1 through 10 are characteristics of the Voynich. And so I consider that very suspicious that it has so many. A genuine object might have, 1 or 2 of them for various reasons that can be understood, but really, to have so many, I think, is highly suspicious and more than coincidental. Going through the list, we have anachronistic content. The first thing that drew me to the Voynich was that the jars, what are called jars, pharmaceutical jars, seen on the left here, didn't look much like pharmaceutical jars to me, and they don't look like herbal or pharmaceutical jars to me. They look actually all the world like microscopes, telescopes, early optics from the 17th, 18th century, and even 19th century. And here's a good example. These two supposed jars on the left, I'll just call them cylinders, have very similar characteristics to these two 18th century Spanish eyeglasses. They're actually, I guess, spy glasses for the opera. And you can see that they have parallel sides. They have stepped diameters. That's because the sections have to slide in one another to focus. Ridged, they have those ridged rings at the ends of them, and they have recessed tops, like optics have when a lens is recessed from the top. They even have the light blue and green tints to them, which a lot of early optics actually had because of impurities in the glass. Here's another example. The one on the right was actually down the street from Voynich when he had his bookstore in Florence, Italy. Again, you have the parallel sides, the multiple diameters, the recessed top, and note also at the bottom you have what looks like it could be knurling, and that would be to get a grip on the section, so you could adjust the focus, so you could turn them or pull them apart. And just a smattering of examples from 17th and actually 18th century, showing a lot of these features that we see in the Voynich. And here is a selection of cylinders from the Voynich. There's many more than these, with all of these characteristics. One thing to note too is the center top one, the feet look like little fins, kinda, like almost like fish fins, and some of the others do. Well, a motif on many 17th and 18th century microscopes, the motif, the design of the legs was as dolphins, known as delphini, and sometimes the fins would be down, sometimes the heads would be down, and so that's another sort of an optical characteristic, if you want, that was used in early microscopes. And there's many other things. I'm not alone in this, by the way. You'll see very often people writing, this looks so much like, something else, and then after that they say, well, it's too new. Well, it happens over and over again. These are, of course, a few of mine, but you'll see it, many people will make this observation, even if they believe the Voynich is genuine. In this case, we have what I believe could be an armadillo on the left. He's got his head curled down there. You can see his snout, and his little eye, and a little ear, little pointy ears sticking up to the right there. He's curled, he has scales. Some people have said, oh, it's probably a pangolin. But this is anachronistic, because if it's an armadillo, it's New World, and it's post-Columbus. And again, I'm not the first person, nor the last person, I don't think, to note this, that there's so many two modern things, two new things in the Voynich, anachronistic in other words. In this case, we have on the left there what was deemed to be a sunflower. I was always unclear if it's that one or the next one or both, but I think it was Hugh O'Neill back, I think, in the 1950s that said that that's a sunflower and it's New World, therefore he felt it was a New World work. And on the right, there's other plants. I think there's a pepper plant in there that was also deemed to be a New World plant. This is not an exact representation. In fact, the green objects there, some people have said look like testes, but many people have noted that the drawings of the tubes and whatnot look like lungs, intestines, reproductive organs, and so on. This is not a practice of the 15th century. This is a practice of much later to actually draw images of anatomical organs. And it goes on. Again, these are a couple of mine. Other people have noted Rosicrucian symbolism, which is far too late for the dating of the calf skin, and the paradigm of 1420, approximately 1420. In the case in the top there, we have the symbol of the roses in the form of a rose garland from a 17th century text, and on the left, a woman holding garlands. Okay, could be other things, but it goes on and on like this all the time. In fact, that page has a fleur-de-lis and some other Rosicrucian symbolism in it, and others have seen this in the book. At the bottom I have a puzzle root, and the roots can be animals of different kinds. It's like a lion and an eagle and all kinds of other things, but they look like them. And in this case, it's what looks to me all the world like a puzzle root. And that puzzle piece of that type was not invented till the late 19th century. Red flag number 2, contrary expert opinion. All over the board. You can see spans decades, if not hundreds of years. This is just a selection of many. Most of these are from Mary D'Imperio's the Voynich Manuscript, An Elegant Enigma. There's a couple others in there that I've thrown in, but you could basically create a list. It's 5 times that long. Expert opinion all over the place. People seeing all different cultures, all different styles, all different meanings in it. New World, Old World, Asian, European, Northern European, Italian, Middle Eastern, and so on. It's confused all the experts, and that's a big red flag of forgery. Poor missing provenance, another red flag. In this case, there's no acceptable record of sale or ownership. Now recently, someone has said, oh, there's a 1903 record, which basically says a 15th century book on calfskin. Well, that's the thing. There's no actual description of the book that's good in anybody's catalog. I told you it was owned by Rudolf II of Habsburg, Holy Roman Emperor, and he, when he was overthrown in 1611, a catalog was made of all his belongings, artwork, books, and so on, scientific instruments, and it doesn't appear there. And then Kircher, the great polymath, he supposedly got the book after receiving several pages of it, and it doesn't appear in any of his listings or catalogs, and really nowhere else. It basically appears in 1912. It doesn't match the Kircher letters very well. Well, the letters, this polymath Kircher, Jesuit polymath, was sent supposedly descriptions of the book, pages, copies of pages from the book, which all disappeared, and the book itself, he supposedly received it. But the description only says, plants unknown to the Germans, in an unknown script, with stars and possible chemical symbolism, which could describe many, many books that these men discussed that people would be interested in having Kircher look at. It doesn't include the zodiac. It doesn't include the naked women or only the bizarre imagery of the book. So it's a very bad description and does not match those letters very well, although they're often used as quote-unquote proof of provenance, and it really isn't. And here's an example of some of these scripts that are in the Kircher letters. 2,000 letters actually in the Villa Mondragone, where Voynich supposedly bought the Voynich. And you can see that there's many different scripts that were unknown to these men that they could describe this way, and chemical symbolism and so on, stars and everything. Another red flag, if your seller, owner, lies about it, well, Wilfrid Voynich said he got it from a castle in southern Europe. Okay. Wilfrid Voynich also said he got it from the Villa Mondragone. Wilfrid Voynich also said he got it from an Austrian castle. Now these are three different places. Two of them are clearly lies. So, there you go. And he also said that John Dee owned it in a 1921 lecture. The problem is that in the notes to the lecture, in his bibliography of the lecture, the quote by John Dee's son, Arthur, that his father owned a book of hieroglyphics that he wanted to have, solved. Well, in that very book that Voynich references, it explains that book, I think it's the Book of Dunstan, but it's some other book being referenced. Voynich said it could be the Voynich. He knew it wasn't his own book. He knew it wasn't his own work. He was lying about it in that lecture. And here's an interesting one. I dug up some letters. It turns out that Charles Singer, the expert on ancient botanicals, herbals and botanicals, was going around lecturing about the Voynich. And he said, yeah, I saw it at Joseph Baer's. And he said it was like 25 years earlier, something like that. So Joseph Baer is a book dealer in Frankfurt. He said he saw it there between 1905 and 1908. So that basically is evidence that there's another lie there, that it didn't even turn up in 1912. That as early as 1905, it was already floating around. Another red flag of forgery is incorrect use of iconography. Well, this is kind of a tough one with the Voynich because so many of the items can be said to be not what you think they are or something else. So, for instance, if someone says A is incorrectly used as B or B is incorrectly used as A, the other person can just say, well, it's not really B and it's not really A. So it's all subjective. Most of it's subjective. However, here's an example that I think points this out pretty well. The most commonly used example of the famous gallows in the Voynich, you can see those standing characters in both of these images, down at the bottom in the Voynich and at the top in a book by Capelli, Book of Lexicography. it's often cited as like the one really good case of an example. There are other smattering of little pieces of these and something somewhat similar, but this really does look like the same thing. And in the case of Capelli, though, they're actually decorative. They're a decorative element. On the Voynich, they're used, believed to be used, seemingly used as a character. And this does show up in various other forgeries. The idea that a decorative element is mistaken for a script, or a script is mistaken as a decorative element, and because of a lack of understanding by a forger. So I believe this is a good example of that. Improper methods or materials. This is a big red flag of forgery when this is seen. In the case of the Voynich, there's several cases of this. The quire numbers, these are the little numbers to mark those bundles of pages folded and sewn together to build up a book. Normally they're centered in the center back of a quire bunch, but in the case of the Voynich, they're in the corners. They're in little folded corners at the corners of the pages. They're sort of incomplete here and there. They're generally considered genuine, the quire numbers, and they're in the wrong place. So this, I believe, might be a sign that the pages are actually the bifolios that make up the Voynich are cut down from larger folios, that someone came across larger normal-sized quires and cut them into quarters and used them to make the bifolios. There's other evidence of this, like white cut edges on a lot of the pages and so on. And then the quire numbers would end up in the wrong place. Unusual foldouts. I'm not the one who calls them unusual. I learned this from the experts themselves, and the ones that basically, say that it's genuine, even in the latest Yale book, when they point out the foldouts, they can't explain them. They'll say they're very unusual because they know that. They really foldouts like this, sometimes 5, 7 sections, 9 sections in the case of the rosettes, didn't appear until hundreds of years later in books. It was not done in the 15th century. When the Macron tests came out, they're the ink testers, and they gave the composition of the inks, the chemical composition, and they noted that the copper and zinc that they found was somewhat unusual. They said it may be due to a brass inkwell. Well, I wrote to them and asked them, is that normal? Why is it unusual? Is it normal for brass inkwells? Is it not normal for it to leach out, or are they unusual to use brass inkwells in the 15th century? What was unusual to them? But they never answered me. They also pointed out there's a titanium compound. I also asked them about that, but they never really answered the question. And anyone familiar with the Voynich map, the Vinland map, is familiar with the controversy over the titanium compound in that ink, although it seems to revolve around it being a different form, anatase and whatnot. But I'm not so sure that it belongs in any of these questions that have to be answered. It would be the wrong material if it obviously if it's in the ink and doesn't belong there. Here's one that I think really jumps out, and it would be like the one thing that I would say is of most importance, that demands more attention but doesn't get it. On the last page of the Voynich is this marginalia, and for a long time people said, well, it's a different style, so it's done probably by a different person in a different hand. It's written differently, and it has different characters than the Voynich, and so it's probably made later by somebody who was trying to figure the Voynich out, or just some kind of note made by some other observer, the book reader of the book. Not that anybody could read it. Anyway, at one point, I started noticing after the ink tests that people who believe the Voynich is genuine were saying, well, the marginalia was written by the same person as wrote the main text. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, why? So why would they say that? So I went back and looked at the ink report, and it turned out that the ink of the marginalia is the same composition, the same ink as the main text. It was written in the same, so all of a sudden now it's the author wrote it. I don't think so. Well, I do think so if it was a forger, because I believe that marginalia was probably put there purely for effect and purposely done in a different style, expecting probably that it would never be tested in the way that it was in modern times. Many people have said this. I've seen the Voynich, and I agree. Adam McLean, Dana Scott, others have seen it and said that it looks too new. Now, these people do believe that it's genuine. Don't get me wrong, but they've walked away with the impression that many of the pages, although the front and the back and the edges are pretty beat up, that the inside are bright, crisp, clean, and kind of jump at you as being very new. That's, of course, a big red flag of forgery right there. Reluctance to produce original. Voynich was very careful. And later, after he passed away, his wife was very careful, and the secretary Ann Nill, I've read all of their correspondence, they were very careful to only show it to people who were favorable to it being a genuine book by Roger Bacon. That was their pet theory. And obviously, if they were totally confident in it, they wouldn't have had to worry about that. And so this is a big red flag of forgery right there. Use of illustrations from books and catalogs. Not the first person again to note this. In fact, it goes on today. Although most people consider it genuine, you'll see example after example will say, oh, it looks like this, and they'll find things on Google, the scans from books and whatnot. They'll say, oh, it looks like this, Well, very often, well, almost every single time that a good illustration is made, it's actually a book before 1910, by the way. And in this case, I'm showing a wheel from the Voynich in the upper right, which is a garden. There's people in there picking fruits or vegetables or something. And it matches up very close. It's a very similar look to a cross-section of a wheat stem from 1909 microscope. And you can see in the bottom they kind of overlap well there. Here is another find of mine. This on the right is a diatom from Carpenter's Treatise on the Microscope from the late 19th century. Actually, that diatom was discovered off the coast of Japan in the 19th century. It's also enlarged at 512 times. That's both anachronistic, but it's also a very good match, so it's in the section here from illustrations from books and catalogs. On the left, the Voynich wheel is so close that they overlap, and when they overlap, the proportions of all the parts line up very, very well, although of course the Voynich is much cruder. The star in the center, the wheel just outside of that, the one outside of that, the spokes, the little oval blob thingies there hit all of those, the little arcs, and the outer wheel, they all match pretty close. And again, diatoms too. The interesting thing is, if you read back, people say, oh, it looks like there's diatoms in there. But of course they can't be, because it's quote-unquote too old. And here's another example. That's from the same book as the diatom I just showed you. Well, which one is from the Voynich? Which one is the marine organism under a microscope? It's hard to tell at first glance. They're very close, same color too and everything. I mean, obviously there's differences, but I think more than coincidental that these books, all of these books, have so many illustrations that match very closely illustrations from the Voynich. Another example here is the Michael Myers Atalanta fusions, and in it he has that engraving on the left, which is of bird representing air and another bird representing earth, because he's in his nest. And there's a page on the Voynich which I call the elements page, the 4 elements, showing air, earth, fire, and water, and they use a bird as earth in a mound. I haven't seen that anywhere else. It's a very close, to me, idea to the Michael Myers book there. Promise of financial gain, big red flag. Well, Voynich actually offered William Robert Newbold, famously argued that the Voynich was a book by Roger Bacon, and Voynich offered him money if that attribution would stick and he could sell the book based on it. Here you see, I have that letter, I have a copy of the letter somewhere, but this is just the shorthand note that came from the letter or was used to make the letter, possibly by Ann Nill, his secretary. It says that Professor Newbold will get 10% of $100,000, the first $100,000. That would be, in today's dollars, the 10% would be about $160,000, and he would get 50% of anything over $100,000. So that's quite an incentive to keep up the Roger Bacon work and He certainly did until he died. Of course, after he died, it all fell apart, and people realized it's not by Roger Bacon. Part 2. Why it matters. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because, like my illustration here, it's like of the old joke. The guy loses his car keys, and he's under the street light, and the policeman's trying to help him find his car keys, and they can't find them, and he says, the cop says to the guy, "Are you sure you lost them here?" He says, "No, I didn't lose them here. I lost them over there in the park, but it's dark in the park." Well, you can't just look under the street light. There are so many ideas. For instance, here, under the owl, you'll see card in there for card and grill. Famously, Gordon Rugg suggested that some machine method, possibly card and grill, may have been used to assemble the words of the Voynich as from sections from various charts and things. And then he's often, the rebuttal to that is, it can't be the card and grill. The card and grill is too new. So that's the main reason that he's basically dismissed. And it's like that for so many other ideas. If you're outside of the 1420 European paradigm, it opens up a whole new world of cipher and cipher types that could be tried, that people aren't, I've been the head of the VoynichNet for some time. I've seen so many systems. I've read everything on the Voynich. So many times people will say, hey, I'd like to try this, or I'd like to try that, and then they're discouraged because they're basically shot down. It's too new. It wouldn't have been invented yet. There's no example of it being around yet. And the people, these techniques, these methods don't get the attention that they deserve, or that they should have to see if they actually would work or not. I personally like the idea of Francis Bacon's biliteral cipher. There's so many other things that can be tried. Here you have also Wilkins Mercury, which famously has various forms of steganography, and that's what you see at the bottom there in the form of musical notes, and so on and so forth. These should all be tried, and they're not getting the attention they deserve. And in conclusion, I'm often reminded of one of the 4 idols of Francis Bacon, the idol of the cave, because if you stay in your cave and trust only the authority that you esteem and admire, and the books and authority that you esteem and admire, you might never see the answer. If the answer is outside of that cave that you've created or that you trust, then the Voynich will never be solved. And personally, I think that this whole idea that people are stuck in this paradigm is possibly the #1 reason why the Voynich has never been solved.